All right, welcome to the High River and District Healthcare Foundation. My name is Jody, and this is episode 2 of our healthcare conversations that we are having over the next year in support of women's health in our rural communities. And today we are joined by our High River Hospital Chaplain, Darrin Parkin. Darrin, thanks for coming on to chat with us today.
You're welcome, Jody. Good to see you.
Now, I know our topic today, when we dive into it, is going to feel a little bit heavy. So before we do that, let's touch base really quick on how awesome the lights are going with Points of Light and the candy cane lane that is outside of the hospital, because that program, along with the 50/50 cash raffle, is helping to support both palliative and spiritual care at the hospital, which we know you are so closely tied to.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Any updates you can have? It's exciting for this time of the year to see that. As you know, we go all out. So if you see the front of the hospital, you know exactly what we're doing, and it's not, you can't miss it, and it's wonderful. And yeah, it's that time of the year. So we're grateful to our supporters for all of that.
Well, and I think when it comes to the thought of lighting a bulb in somebody's honor, it gives this really great opportunity to honor someone. And then it got us on the team really thinking about it's difficult to honor a loved one, especially if there's someone that you've lost in your life, or if you're experiencing loss of any kind. We know it's been a really trying couple of years for people, and the environment is kind of tumultuous, if I may be so
Yeah,
bold to say, Darrin. And so we wanted to chat with you today about diving a little bit into dealing with grief, any
sure.
tips or tools that you can help. And we know that the Christmas season can also feel really stressful for people. And it's not always the joyous, happy moments that everybody is having this time of year. So, Darrin, how do we start off with, I don't know, is it taking a moment to acknowledge if we are experiencing grief in our lives?
Yeah, that's probably the best way to start any conversation about grief is to recognize that's the moment we're in. And as you mentioned, at the holiday time, all of those feelings for people tend to be very, very elevated. If for any of our viewers, this is the first Christmas since the loss of a loved one, they know exactly how elevated their feelings are, how poignant and how pointed the grief is, and how painful it can be to reconsider how to do Christmas traditions, holiday traditions, um, with a member of the family that's not present, or a good friend, or anybody in their world that they've lost. It's tough. It's tough at the holidays, and when you add the fact that we've lived in a pandemic for the last almost 2 years. If we were having a normal conversation about grief, we might talk about the different types of grief. We might talk a bit about complicated grief, which is a bit of a misnomer. But I think we have to recognize now that we are all experiencing complex, complicated grief for a whole myriad of reasons and a whole lot of factors. And so I think the starting point is to recognize this is what I'm feeling. This is hard. I feel empty and a big, as if there is a big hole inside of me without this person that I love. And I don't know how I'm going to make it through the holidays without this person. And sometimes some people's response to that is to celebrate Christmas and the holidays very, very differently, or even not at all. And there's no wrong way of doing that. So it's a very, very, I would say, intense time of grief for those who are grieving and have been for some time. And it's not just if they're facing their first Christmas since the loss of a loved one. Every Christmas and every holiday season, every significant day reintroduces the felt impact of the loss of that loved one, and it's just very, very hard. It seems like there are no ways to kind of grab hold of that and manage that well. It just has a life of its own, and I think that's probably the first recognition. And we're all in that right now in a strange, strange way, and particularly those who've lost somebody recently. This is a very, very difficult time, and acknowledging that, I think, is a good starting point.
Well, I think when it comes to, I like that you bring up that there's all kinds of grief, because I think when you've lost a special person in your life, it's easy to identify that that's the source of the grief. But like you said, going through a pandemic, we're feeling emotions that we maybe haven't ever felt before can't truly identify, because grief, like you said, can come in so many fashions. So we could be grieving the loss of the way life was before, the loss of how freedom felt, the loss of, being able to see family members face to face, like whatever that might look like.
Yeah.
It's hard to, I don't know, to name it, to tame it, for a lack of a better phrase.
That's exactly right. One of the one of the things we recognized in the healthcare system in the last year and a half, particularly, and that's kept me somewhat rather busy, is the impact of the grief upon staff and family members of staff within the hospital system, within any healthcare system. We have lived through this whole thing, and it has been sustained. It is not let up. And every time we kind of get to the point where, okay, maybe this is going to let up, and they're going to, like we did in the summer when we eased restrictions a little bit, people started to feel like, okay, now I can kind of depressurize and re-enter normal, quote unquote, living. And then that was taken again. Then we hit this other wave and back to restrictions and that sort of thing. So it's been never ending. What trauma therapists recognize is that for the human being, we are quite good at marshaling resources for an immediate crisis. So in our evolutionary history, that's our flight or fight response. We're very good. We have the natural inborn ability to handle an immediate crisis and respond to that. And then we have to decompress afterwards. What they say we're not good at, though, is when that level of anxiety, grief, intense stress is sustained for a long period of time. The human being is not well suited for that kind of an experience. And that's exactly what we've lived for the last year and a half. We've had families that have come for healthcare in all of our healthcare institutions who've had to deal with visiting restrictions in the last year and a half. We've had people that have lost loved ones and they couldn't visit them at the time, couldn't be with them at the time of death. And that is absolutely devastating for a family member to feel like they had to abandon the person they love in the moment they need them the most. And it is incredibly hard on healthcare staff to be involved in that and have to explain to a family member that they can't be present. And we went through some of that. And every healthcare institution in the province and in the country went through that same sort of thing. And that has taken a collective toll on not just the families that have experienced that in such a strong way, that would be the most, but secondarily on the healthcare system itself and the frontline staff who are the wonderful human beings that provide that care. That's taken a significant toll. And it's like we're all living in this cycle that we can't seem to get out of, and it holds our anxiety in an elevated, tense manner. And that I'm concerned about more than anything. More than anything with regards to this pandemic, I am probably more concerned about that. And I don't think I'm alone in sharing that concern, that the impact on people from this last year and a half, we've tried all sorts of ways to try and describe it, but we haven't quite lived through something like this in recent memory. And I'm concerned that there's going to be a long-term effect of this. And as you said, one of the big parts of it is grief, but we didn't see it as that because we thought, hey, this is just a terrible pandemic. It's going to come, it's going to last for a while, and then it's going to be over and we'll move on. And then when it didn't, we started to recognize that there's a lot of grieving going on, but we couldn't quite name it. We couldn't put our finger on it because it was there, but it didn't seem like it fit, because grief we usually associate with the loss of a loved one or the loss of something, a relationship or a job. But this, we've lost an entire way of life. And there is a substantial amount of grief that's collective. I've nicknamed it viral grief, and we're all feeling it. We all share in it. And it's as though it just spread through our community and through our province and our country incredibly quick, and we're stuck still in it. That's the starting point. If on top of that, then you have families that lose loved ones and are going through the death of a loved one, as many of us have, myself included, within this pandemic, then that layer of grief on top of the other one that's existing can have some pretty complex dynamics to it that leave us feeling as though we can't quite catch our breath or sit in that without the anxiety of what shoe drop is going to happen next. And that's been tough, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. So first thing we're going to do is we're identifying and acknowledging that we're feeling. If you don't want to call it grief, you don't have to name it that, but you know you're feeling something. Secondly, Darrin, how do we take the next step? What are some things that we can do, that we can practice to help us move through these stages of grief?
So do you want to kind of aim that at this kind of pandemic kind of grief that we've experienced, or in particular the loss of loved ones, or just general in general grief?
Yeah, well, I think that there's probably going to be a handful of people who watch this who are experiencing all of those things. So I know it's probably not easy to be specific and general at the same time, but there's your challenge today. I need you to be
Okay.
specific and general at the same time. But I think ultimately a lot of the things are relatively similar, some of the things we can do.
There are layers that are very similar. We would encourage responses to grief that could work in both scenarios. I think with regards to the last year and a half that we've lived through as a society, one of the things, or a couple of things that people can do, is partly because we've been sort of forced to somewhat isolate, somewhat limit the sphere in which we can travel, the activities that we can, participate in. It's almost a natural reminder that we can focus on the things that matter the most. And that would be the relationships that we hold as the things that matter the most to us. So what people can do is they can reconnect with family. They can reconnect with the people maybe they haven't been connecting with for some period of time. Because life, when it's normal, or quote unquote normal, we tend to be amazed at how time can pass. We get busy, the other person gets busy, and then we realize that we haven't really connected for a long period of time. So then we do something about it. With this, we are almost in the place where we've had to take stock on what matters most. We couldn't participate in a lot of the relationships that maybe weren't as close. And so it gave us the opportunity to focus in on the ones that matter and the people that we love the most. So for our viewers, if anybody is maybe not connected with a family member or a close friend for some period of time, it's an opportunity to reconnect with those relationships that matter the most. And when doing that, probably to be open and honest about, hey, this has been hard. This is what we've lived through. How are you doing through this? Here's how I'm doing through this. And not just talk about the surface stuff, but actually drill in a little deeper and get into some of the realities of how has this been? How has this been for you? That's a great place to start. And I'm a big believer in naming, as you said earlier, naming those, I call them silences, name the silences, because we tend to live with them. And if we don't put a name to them, we sometimes don't know what's happening to us, what we're feeling. And we feel like we're going crazy and those kind of things. But this is actually part of what the experience is. If we name those things and say, this is how I'm feeling, and it's not bad. It's not wrong to name those kind of things. We have enormous amounts of grief and stress, anxiety that people are feeling. I think it's healthy to name those things and recognize this is what I'm feeling. And when I speak this truth, I connect with others who I may not know, but are feeling the same thing. And then they can share about it as well. And that brings us together. And it's a felt thing when we come together like that. So reconnection would be the first thing that I would suggest would be something that people can do, especially with those people that matter the most. And sometimes those are the most complicated relationships.
Yeah.
Sometimes those are the ones we don't want to reconnect.
Yeah.
But if this pandemic has taught us anything, it might have taught us that there's a fragility to life that we sometimes take for granted. And maybe this is the opportunity to recognize that, this person, despite the little tiff we had or the disagreement or the falling out, this person matters a lot and we don't get a do-over in life. And so here's an opportunity, even though it's been brought to us by an uncomfortable year and a half, this is an opportunity to reach out and build some bridges back again with people that matter to us.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to reconnect. What else can we do in dealing with high stress situations or sadness or whatever it else we might be
Yeah.
feeling.
Yeah. I think due to the nature that this seems ongoing, as I mentioned earlier, we're okay as a species when it comes to the start of some crisis and then the end point. And it's a short period of time and we can identify that. With this, it's just sort of unending. It's like this whole thing takes over our mind and doesn't give us a break, doesn't relent. So what I think is actually a very simple tool is to practice some sort of individualized ritual. Rituals are powerful experiences that people can do to mark boundary times. So in other words, take, for example, people with their work. In my scenario, that's in the healthcare setting in the hospital. Many people, the staff will come into work. They've been living this whole experience as all of us have. The stress is there, the anxiety is there, and then they got to get up and get professional and be caregivers in the course of the day, any day at the hospital or wherever somebody may work. One of the things we encourage people to do is to practice some sort of ritual. In other words, when I come to work, I begin that day's duties or obligations or opportunities. When the day is finished, whatever time that shift ends, whether it's 3 o'clock, 4:30, 5 o'clock, it's really helpful to recognize this is now over. This is now done. Because what the pandemic has done is it's stripped from us, taken away from us any opportunity to recognize this has come to an end. And we've been denied any kind of boundary that says this is now over and we can resume or move on to some other way of life. If we can't do that through this macro, massive level of thing that we've lived through, what we can do is do it in little bits and pieces of our personal lives to mark boundary changes. One of them is when the day is over. So with nursing staff, we all wear ID badges or tags or lanyards. What people can do is when they're at the end of their day, whatever they have that identifies them as a healthcare worker or whatever field of work somebody does, they can take that lanyard off or that name tag off, and in a little 10-second ritual, say to themselves, by taking this ID badge or name tag off, I'm recognizing that today, my work today is finished. I've done all I can do. And now I take this off to go and resume my life because it matters, and my family and the people that I care about. And whatever happened in my day today is now behind me. I'm going to lay it to rest and leave it there, knowing that full well tomorrow, I'm going to put this ID badge back on and I'll resume those duties again tomorrow. But for now, between now and tomorrow, it's my private life. It's my time with family. It's my time to get exercise, to play sports, whatever, to walk outside, whatever it is that I enjoy to do. That's my time to do that. So that's a boundary marker. And you can actually get very creative with those kind of ritualistic boundaries where you just pay attention to the fact that, okay, this thing or this event or this period of time is now concluded. It's over. And we're going to move on to the next one. Marking the passing of those boundaries, I think, is very healthy. And it's one of the things that we've not been able to do too well in the last while. But we can do that in our individual lives in little practical ways. It's something that sounds almost too simple to do, but it does have an effect.
Yeah.
It does have an effect. It says, I'm going to let myself renew for the next thing because the thing that I just finished doing is done.
Yeah.
And I leave it behind me. A lot of us carry our work home, if not in our papers or our whatever, then certainly in our thoughts. And it's really tough to switch that off. And if there was ever a time in human life where it's important to switch off, this is the time to do that. So any of those little things, occasions that we can mark the closing of one period of time, as short as it may be and as simple as it may be, any ritual that marks that is wonderful and healthy for us.
Well, I like too that you brought up some examples in there of things people could do, say, whether it's after the ritual or at some point in the day, like doing a sport or just going for a walk in nature. There's like incredible healing properties with
Yeah.
being in nature, or maybe it's doing something with the dog or the cat or the kid or the whatever. There's lots of ways to kind of do that transition. So I like that you mentioned some of those.
It's also really healthy for kids because kids may not know all the exact logical details of what this whole thing has done for us all, but they sure feel the emotional difference. And so a way to mark those kind of things and then be present, because that's the real goal when we mark a boundary and say, okay, this period of time that we've done this duty is done. Now I want to be fully present. That's the thing that I'm concerned that we lost and we're losing through this. It's the ability to be present to those that matter to us. Kids, obviously, partners, spouses, significant others, whoever and however many they may be. Those connections are extremely important. And when we live under an intense period of time of pressure, what we lose is the ability to be present. We're always thinking about the stuff we did before, or we're worried about the stuff that comes next. And that robs us from the ability to be present in the moment. And that's where I think human happiness and joy actually is found. It's being present in the moment, not worrying about what's behind us or fretting about what's ahead of us, because we all know there's enough to fret about.
Well, and I like too with even the simplicity of the rituals, Darrin, is nice because a lot of our conversation over the next year is focused on women's health, and we'll be honest that probably the female leader of the family is just that, a leader of the family. And so if we can help equip the moms, the wives, the grandmas, the caregivers with this sort of toolbox, it allows them to help the husbands or spouses or children or other members of the family to go through that too. So if you, as the woman leader of your family, can go through that ritual, okay, I'm in a good space. Now I'm going to help Bob and Jimbo and Mary and whoever else, like down the line, like it allows you to help the others in your family.
Yeah. Like very true.
Now, what about when it comes to I wanted to get your thoughts before I let you go here on how do we help other people during this time frame? So there's one thing when we're dealing with our own piece of grief, but when we have friends or family members who have lost, family members from their in-law side, or friends who have lost someone in their life, or just being a community citizen who loses another community citizen, how do we help people? And what are some things that we could say and or do to help people through their grief process?
Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that one. That's probably people's biggest fear is how do I talk to somebody when they've lost someone? What do I say? And actually, a majority of people will, and it's most people, be honest, and will admit this, even though they're embarrassed to admit this. Most people will have the tendency to avoid somebody who's lost a loved one because simply they don't know what to say, and they're afraid that they'll make them hurt even more. When the opposite is true, there is nothing that we can say, because we think that if we bring up the death of a loved one to somebody who's grieving, we think that we're going to add that thing, they're going to start thinking about it again, and it's going to cause them sadness. They're already thinking about that person all the time. There's nothing we can say that's going to add to that. What we're doing when we check in with somebody is we're giving them the space and the opportunity to feel that together with us. So one of the things we can do is check in with people. One of the things that my siblings and we lost my dad in April of this year. So one of the things we've started doing, and we did it right from the period of time that he was dying and still today, is we have a group chat on WhatsApp, and we also have a group text. And that's a great way to connect with people. And you can have, hey, sky's the limit. You can have as many group texts as you want for different groups of people in your life. Maybe some of them don't know each other, so you have different groups. And you know what? Check in on people. Just say, hey, how's everybody doing? It's a lot easier than having to go somewhere. It's a very simple thing. And then you can often identify that someone might, benefit from just a real personal check-in visit. Drop over and say, I don't know what to say or do. I don't know what you need, but if you need the wok shoveled or if you need some frozen lasagna brought over, I can do those things. And don't be afraid to do that. Don't worry about not knowing what to say, because it's not expected that you say the hallmark thing.
Yeah.
You're not expected to do that. People who just go and say, I'm sorry, I don't know how you must feel, I don't know, but I'm here, I'm present, and whatever I can do to help, or whatever memories you'd like to talk about and I can share and listen to, I'm game, I'm on, I'm in.
Yeah.
And be present to somebody. Those are some ways we can do that. But don't be afraid of causing more grief for somebody, because you can't. Their grief is
already there.
Yeah. It's already there.
Yeah. No, and I think it's the biggest thing is we fear saying the wrong thing. So then we say nothing at all. And then we let too much time pass. And then we don't know how to bridge that gap back. And that other person might be like, all I needed was just a full, like, where were you during that time frame? So it just take the step and just be like, I'm sorry for your loss.
Yep. There's no formula for what to say with somebody. And sometimes saying nothing is the best thing. And guess what? That's the easiest thing to do.
Yeah.
Just tune in with 2 ears and a heart that's open, and listen. And don't be afraid if the person shares emotion and sadness and cries or any of those things, because that's in the grief business, when we do grief work, when somebody's crying, we feel like we've made a space where that can happen. We're doing our job, because that's a healthy thing. It's not something to be afraid of. I know a lot of people who've had a loss who have said, somebody so-and-so who I knew very well didn't even call.
Yeah.
It's like they're avoiding me.
Yeah.
And it's very hurtful. It's understandable, but it's very hurtful. And it's simply the fear of not knowing what to do, what to say in that awkward space of being with somebody who is in intense grief.
Well, I think maybe it's to our benefit that there was the creation of emojis. So now you don't even need to have a word. You could just text somebody the little hug one, the heart one, or something. It shows that you're having that thought without you feeling like you have to have the right words. Just show you're caring.
Yep.
Yeah. And listening.
Wonderful idea.
I think those are the biggest ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Do you have a place for a suggestion or anything where if people were wanting to learn more about either how they can help their own selves, help other people, is there resources that you would recommend that people could check out?
There's lots of stuff online you can get about dealing with grief. Alan Wolfelt is a wonderful grief resource. If you are dealing with grief with children, that's one that stumps most adults. We don't know how to help children who are grieving. You can go to the Children's Grief Center in Calgary. It's the recognized grief center for children in the country, Hospice Calgary and the Grief Center. Enormous amount of resources for helping children grieve and how to talk about grief and death and dying with children. It's something that historically we haven't done very well. We've kind of tried to hide that from children, and that doesn't actually help, because they know something's happening. They're picking up on that. And now, because nobody's talking about it, it's this big fearful thing that nobody puts specifics to. Children are actually very, very good at processing grief if we let them. So check out Children's Grief Center in Calgary. If you can find a grief support group anywhere, I know there might be some restrictions around groups meeting currently. Sometimes they're meeting online. You can do that. There are a number of places you can go if you do a simple search in your community for grief support. You can check with any counseling agency. They will have staff that are particularly drawn to providing grief counseling support. And it's really a fancy way of saying this is a professional person who has a really good listening ear and some good tips and things that won't make it go away, but will make a place for you to discover some things that you can do in the midst of experiencing that grief. Because there's no end to grief. There's no stoppage to it. There's no time out. The waves will keep coming. So what can we give people? to recognize that's going to happen and to support them. There's lots of stuff out there, and a simple Google search will give some. Look for civic groups in a community. Sometimes church groups have grief recovery support groups. Any experience where you're grieving together, I find them some of the most powerful supportive environments is when people gather as a group that have gone through a loss, because they all know the silent language and the silent things that haven't been spoken. They're all in the same boat together, and they find that that can be very, very supportive, that others are going through the same thing and can be supportive one to another.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate your time today, Darrin, in talking about, I mean, I think you've always done this so gracefully, is that you're able to speak about these types of topics with such grace. And that's not an easy topic for people, but the more we talk about it, the more comfortable we can get with it and the more we can help each other through it. So we just really appreciate you taking time to share with us today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
All right. Well, you have a great day, and maybe you should take some pictures out in Candy Cane Lane later.
It's a great idea. Them too, you can post them.
Yeah, we're gonna hold you to it, friends. You've heard it here. He's gonna send me pictures to post on the social media, so it's gonna be great. Darrin, thank you again for joining us today.
You're most welcome.